Mark Hastings had never considered himself the kind of man who got into disputes with neighbors. He worked quietly as a maintenance supervisor for the county's water department, a job that kept him close to pipes, gauges, and the steady rhythm of machines that didn't talk back. His weekends were spent at the edge of town, on the piece of land his parents had left him, a narrow strip that climbed toward a low ridge where an old water tower stood, its silver body scarred with rust and faint graffiti from another decade. The tower had always been there, visible from the road like an unacknowledged landmark, feeding a few scattered homes, including the clubhouse and community garden owned by the local HOA. Mark didn't think much about that connection. He paid his own bills, handled his own plumbing, and assumed the rest was handled by whoever it was supposed to be. The tower was just part of the landscape, a relic that hummed when the sun heated its skin and clicked softly in the cold at night. It had sentimental weight for him, too. His father, a lineman and amateur tinkerer, had helped maintain it back in the 80s, and some of the welds near the base still bore his initials. Whenever Mark ran his hand along the seams, he felt that small human signature under the layers of oxidation, a stubborn proof that something of his family had survived the decades. On Saturdays, he would unlock the small gate, check the pressure meters, clear away the creeping vines, and make sure the pumps in the underground shed still hummed in rhythm. There was a quiet comfort in it. He didn't see himself as a landowner, much less as someone capable of causing administrative trouble. The tower worked. People had water. That was enough. Late one morning, as the spring wind pushed dry leaves across the gravel drive, he found a sheet of paper wedged under the chain of the gate. It was printed on glossy stationery with the HOA's seal at the top, an emblem of neat geometry and false order. The letter was short, almost polite, and yet the words carried a bureaucratic chill that stuck to his skin long after he read them. Notice of violation, unauthorized structure within community jurisdiction. The water tower located adjacent to parcel 47A is in breach of code, paragraph 11.04. Please remove the structure within 14 days to avoid further penalties. Mark read it twice, his eyes tracing the sentence as if expecting it to change. He looked up at the tower, silent and motionless in the pale sun, and then back at the letter. Breach of code, unauthorized structure. He wasn't even part of the HOA. At first he assumed it was a mistake, some overreach from a newly elected board with too much time on its hands. But the following week, a second letter arrived by certified mail, followed by an email sent through an HOA contact portal he hadn't known existed. It referenced community boundaries and liability zones, and this time included a fine. The sum wasn't huge, but the principle of it made his pulse quicken. He called the number listed at the bottom and spoke to a woman whose voice was perfectly calm, almost rehearsed. She insisted that the water tower encroached on association property, and that non-compliance could trigger enforcement through civil channels. When he asked who had drawn the boundary line, she simply replied, "Our legal surveyors. Everything has been verified." Then she ended the call. That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, flipping through the file folders his father had kept. The old permits, maintenance receipts, yellowing schematics with hand-drawn notes in fading pencil. The earliest document he could find dated back to 1987 and bore the county seal. It described the tower as part of a joint-use infrastructure project between the county and local residents before the HOA even existed. He stared at the phrase for a long time. The tower wasn't his property, but it wasn't theirs either. It belonged, technically, to the county, or to no one, depending on how one read the paperwork. The thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. If something so permanent, so visible, could suddenly become a violation, then maybe nothing was truly stable. When the wind rose later that night, the tower creaked softly in the dark, its old metal joints flexing against the gusts. Mark listened from his porch, the letter folded neatly beside his coffee mug, and felt a slow unease settle in his stomach. He had never thought of that tower as a threat to anyone, but now, for the first time in his life, he began to suspect that owning, or even standing near, something that others wanted to control was a kind of danger all on its own. The silence of the countryside no longer comforted him. It only made the paper's words echo louder in his mind. Something had shifted, quietly but irreversibly, and he knew it would not end with a single letter. The following week began with the quiet rhythm of ordinary days: work, traffic, the distant hum of machinery in the county's maintenance yard. But for Mark Hastings, the sense of normalcy had fractured. He couldn't look at the tower without feeling a low current of anxiety crawling under his skin. The second notice from the HOA wasn't just a threat now. It had escalated into a formal directive demanding immediate removal or relocation. The language was sharp, full of clauses about safety hazards, liability exposure, and non-compliance penalties. It ended with a single line that carried the weight of something final. Failure to comply within the designated time frame will result in legal enforcement at the owner's expense. Mark had no idea what that even meant. He wasn't an owner in their sense. He hadn't built the tower, hadn't registered it, hadn't leased land from anyone, but he also couldn't deny that his name appeared on the notice as responsible occupant. That phrasing stuck with him. Responsible for what, exactly? The air the tower occupied, the rust on its sides, the history he didn't write but somehow inherited. By Wednesday, he decided to confront the matter in person. The HOA office was a small building disguised as a boutique administrative hub, wedged between a dentist's clinic and a Pilates studio. Inside, it smelled faintly of disinfectant and new paper. The receptionist greeted him with the forced brightness of someone paid to deflect emotion. When he explained his situation, she disappeared into the back room and returned with a man wearing a pale gray suit and an expression of calculated indifference. "Mr. Hastings," the man said, shaking his hand as if they were meeting at a business lunch. "I'm Robert Creel, current Director of Operations for the Riverbend Homeowners Association. You've received our notices, I assume?" Mark nodded and handed him the letters. Creel scanned them briefly, his eyes flicking across the pages before setting them down with an air of finality. "The issue," he said, "is rather straightforward. That tower sits within community boundaries according to our recorded plats. It's a structural liability. You can imagine what would happen if it collapsed or contaminated the ground. The board has voted to have it removed." Mark listened carefully, feeling his pulse accelerate. "It's not within your boundary," he said slowly. "It was built before the HOA existed. It's a county installation. I have the original maintenance permits." Creel gave him a thin, knowing smile, the kind that implied both dismissal and quiet amusement. "Those old documents," he said, "are outdated. Jurisdictions change. The association has been delegated responsibility for shared utility structures that fall within our updated survey lines." The man's tone made it sound inevitable, like weather. "But the county never transferred that property," Mark said. "I work for them. I'd know." For the first time, Creel's smile wavered. "Then perhaps you should speak with your department," he said coolly. "I'm sure the paperwork will confirm what I've told you. We're acting within our rights." And just like that, the conversation ended. That evening, Mark stayed late at the county facility, digging through the archives in the small records room that smelled of dust and metal shelving. He found old binders labeled Infrastructure Shared Use Agreements and spent hours flipping through photocopied maps, signatures, and inspection reports. The tower appeared again and again under various project names. Joint Pressure Unit 4, Reservoir 17A, Westline Hydration Node. Each time it was tied to the county, never the HOA. But then, in the most recent files, something strange appeared. A memorandum dated just 2 years earlier, referencing a temporary oversight transfer to Riverbend Administrative Council. The signature line was blank, and the form bore no county seal. It looked like a draft that had somehow been filed as an official document. He stared at it, tracing the uneven edges of the printed page. Someone had inserted this quietly, with precision. The document didn't transfer ownership. It implied it in careful bureaucratic language, and that implication was now being used as fact. When he brought it to his supervisor the next morning, the man frowned but didn't look surprised. "Don't get involved in that, Mark," he said. "Those agreements are political. We don't touch them unless the county attorney tells us to." Mark asked what would happen if an external party, say an HOA, claimed jurisdiction over active infrastructure. The supervisor rubbed his temples and muttered, "Then it becomes their liability, not ours. Let them pay for it. We've got enough to handle." It was meant to sound dismissive, but for Mark, the words landed like a warning. If the county was willing to let go of the structure in silence, the HOA would seize it without resistance, and once they did, they'd make it disappear, along with the truth of how it ever existed. 2 days later, a yellow sign appeared near the base of the tower. "Pending removal, unsafe structure, authorized by HOA committee." Mark stood before it at dusk, the metal sign reflecting the dying sunlight, and felt a strange dizziness. None of this was logical. The tower hadn't changed. It hadn't suddenly become unsafe. Only the interpretation of its existence had shifted. He felt, for the first time, how fragile facts could become when rewritten on the right letterhead. A woman walking her dog paused nearby and asked if the tower was finally coming down. When he said no, she gave him a puzzled look, as if he'd refused something inevitable. "I heard it leaks chemicals," she said, tugging on the leash. "That's what they told us in the meeting." Mark didn't answer. He walked back to his truck, the cool air pressing against his face, his thoughts running faster than his steps. The HOA had moved beyond property claims. They were rewriting memory, spreading a new version of history in which he was the negligent occupant of an obsolete hazard. And maybe, in their world of manicured lawns and official minutes, that was all it took to make something true. That night, he couldn't sleep. The sound of the tower's hollow resonance filled the dark, a faint metallic pulse like a heartbeat echoing through the stillness. For years it had been just a structure, a forgotten relic. Now it had become a dividing line between what was real and what could be erased by collective agreement. When he finally drifted into restless sleep, one thought stayed with him. The HOA wasn't just demanding the removal of metal and bolts. They were erasing the idea of who owned truth itself, and he was the only one still standing in its shadow. By the time the third week arrived, Mark had stopped counting the notices. They came folded in identical envelopes, each with a slightly different wording, each one colder than the last. The language grew more technical, citing regulations he had never heard of, sections of property law that sounded both official and incomprehensible. One letter mentioned unauthorized maintenance activity and interference with inspection personnel, which confused him until he realized they were referring to his routine visits to check the valves and gauges at the base of the tower. He was being accused of tampering with his own work, as if the ordinary upkeep of an aging structure was now a violation. It was the first time he truly felt cornered. The HOA wasn't threatening him with direct force. They were surrounding him with paper, each document a strand in a web that made less and less sense the longer he tried to untangle it. The county offices, where he might have found support, had grown unhelpfully quiet. Calls went unanswered, and emails bounced back with automatic replies about ongoing administrative audits. One afternoon, he drove to the municipal building in person and waited nearly an hour outside the zoning department until a clerk finally emerged, holding a clipboard and a defensive smile. When Mark explained the situation, she hesitated, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear. "Technically," she said, "the ownership of that parcel is still under review. There's a boundary dispute filed by the Riverbend Association. Until it's resolved, we can't issue any official statement." He asked who had filed the dispute. She pretended to check her papers, though he could see from her expression that she already knew. "Their legal representative," she said finally. "It's not unusual. Happens all the time." Mark wanted to ask how often an HOA contested land that wasn't theirs, but her eyes had already shifted to the next person in line. The next morning, 2 men arrived at his property without notice. They wore matching navy jackets with the HOA emblem stitched neatly above the breast pocket. One carried a clipboard, the other a handheld scanner that beeped softly as he walked the perimeter. When Mark stepped outside, the man with the clipboard introduced himself as a compliance officer and asked for access to the tower base. His tone was neither hostile nor polite. It was simply procedural, which somehow made it worse. Mark told them they had no jurisdiction, that the tower was county infrastructure. The man checked a paper, frowned slightly, and said, "According to our updated plat, this area falls within our maintenance zone. You can contest it, of course, but that won't stop enforcement." He reached for the lock on the gate as if it were already his to open. Mark stepped forward and blocked him. The 2 men exchanged a glance that contained no emotion, only silent calculation. Then, without another word, they walked back to their truck and left. The entire encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it felt like something irreversible had occurred, a line crossed that couldn't be redrawn. That evening, he noticed something new. Small wooden stakes driven into the soil around the tower, each topped with a red plastic flag. The flags fluttered faintly in the wind, forming a perfect square that extended several feet beyond the tower's base. It looked like a claim, a geometric act of possession. When he pulled one of the stakes out of the ground, he found a laminated tag stapled to it, reading "Survey Marker, HOA, Utility Division." He stood for a long time in the dusk, holding the marker in his hand, listening to the creak of the tower above him, and realized that they were mapping the ground beneath his feet as if it already belonged to them. In the days that followed, the subtle pressure around him intensified. A neighbor he'd known for years stopped returning his waves. A local hardware supplier refused to sell him replacement valves, citing pending property review. The HOA newsletter, usually filled with announcements about garage sales and gardening tips, featured a short notice warning residents about unapproved water sources and urging them to exercise caution until the matter is resolved. The wording was careful enough to avoid defamation, but sharp enough to isolate him. He became, overnight, a cautionary tale. A man who had built something dangerous, or perhaps just someone who refused to follow the rules. He tried to fight back the only way he knew how, through logic and a documentation. He compiled every receipt, every map, every maintenance log his father had kept, creating a binder thicker than a textbook. Late into the night, he highlighted dates and underlined coordinates, building his argument like a fortress of facts. But with each new letter from the HOA, he felt that fortress eroding. Facts, he discovered, could be ignored simply by not acknowledging them. Authority wasn't always earned. Sometimes it was declared, and then enforced until resistance exhausted itself. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when he arrived home from work to find a printed notice taped to his door. It was from a law firm representing the HOA, and it stated that external contractors will commence dismantling operations pending non-compliance within 72 hours. The phrasing was sterile, but the message was unmistakable. They were preparing to take the tower down. For the first time, he felt genuine fear, not for himself, but for what the act represented. If they could erase something as tangible as a 40-foot steel structure with nothing but signatures and silence, then anything could vanish the same way. That night, rain swept through the valley, a cold, heavy curtain that blurred the outlines of everything familiar. Mark stood under the shelter of his porch, watching the tower in the downpour. Lightning flashed once, and for a split second, the structure was illuminated in stark relief. Every dent, every rivet visible, every imperfection carved against the storm. It looked almost human in that moment, like something enduring a slow punishment. The next day, the ground around it would be slick with mud, and new tire tracks would appear near the fence line, proof that someone had been there again while he slept. But in that moment, as thunder rolled through the distance, he understood the truth that had been forming quietly in his mind for weeks. They weren't after the tower for what it was, but for what it symbolized, an object that stood outside their control, an artifact that refused to fit into the grid of their order. When the rain finally stopped, he walked out into the yard, his shoes sinking into the wet earth, and placed his hand against the cold metal. The surface was rough beneath his fingertips, alive with moisture. Somewhere inside, the old pipe still groaned faintly, carrying pressure through unseen veins, defying the paperwork that sought to render them obsolete. He whispered to no one. "You were here before them." And in that moment, he knew that the fight was no longer about boundaries or laws. It was about erasure and memory, about who had the right to define what existed. The fourth week began with an uneasy quiet, the kind that hides tension rather than diffuses it. Mark Hastings woke each morning to the same view. The tower framed by low clouds, the ground marked by the red flags the HOA had planted, and felt a strange mix of fatigue and defiance. He had begun to catalogue every change around the site, the subtle shifts in the dirt where vehicle tires pressed overnight, the faint smell of solvent near the pump hatch, the new padlock on the service fence that he hadn't installed. Whoever was coming here wasn't hiding their presence. They were demonstrating it, leaving small traces like a signature. The tower itself continued to function flawlessly, the pressure gauges steady, the valves sealed tight. Its silence, once comforting, now felt accusatory, as though it were waiting for him to act before it fell victim to the slow encroachment of official deceit. After another failed attempt to reach the county zoning department, Mark decided to bypass the usual channels. He drove to the archives in the next town over, a musty building that had escaped modernization by virtue of being inconvenient. There, among dusty ledgers and misfiled microfilm, he found something that unsettled him more than the falsified memorandum he'd uncovered earlier, an original topographic survey from the 1980s, drawn in black ink on heavy vellum, showing the water tower's exact coordinates. The tower stood clearly on a tract labeled County Reserve Land, Public Utility Use. The borders of what would later become the HOA's community stopped 20 yards short of that marker. It was indisputable evidence. What caught his attention, though, wasn't the map itself but the notation scrawled in the margin in faded blue pencil. Temporary Joint Maintenance Agreement, see Annex B. There was no annex in the folder. When he asked the clerk for it, she shrugged and said that older annexes were often destroyed when the county digitized its records, a bureaucratic euphemism for disappearance. That evening he sat in his truck outside the tower with the map spread across the steering wheel. The yellowing paper crackled when he ran his thumb along the edges. The discovery should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Proof, he was learning, had little power in a world where people could pretend not to see it. He needed more than evidence. He needed to expose motive. Why would the HOA fight for a patch of land that brought them no direct gain? Unless, he thought, the land wasn't what they wanted. Maybe it was access. He began revisiting the tower's infrastructure schematics, tracing the flow lines that extended beyond the property boundaries. 2 feeder pipes led south toward the main development, supplying not just a few homes, but a small complex of facilities. The community gardens, the ornamental fountains, the irrigation system for their manicured lawns. All of them drew indirectly from his tower. He stared at the map until his eyes blurred. They weren't trying to remove it because it was useless. They were trying to remove it because it was indispensable. Whoever controlled the tower controlled the water supply that quietly kept their landscape alive. The realization hit him with both clarity and dread. If the HOA succeeded in claiming jurisdiction, they could absorb the tower into their management, raise utility fees, and rewrite history to erase the county's involvement entirely. What had begun as a nuisance was now a silent economic takeover. That night, Mark drafted a report detailing his findings, attaching copies of the survey and the infrastructure schematics, and sent it to the county's Public Utilities Division. He didn't expect a swift reply, but within 48 hours, he received a terse email from an address he didn't recognize. "Your submission has been received. Please refrain from further inquiries while review is in progress." The wording was too precise, too cautious. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't a denial, but it wasn't acknowledgement either. It was containment, a way to keep him from digging deeper. Days passed, and the tower's surroundings grew more disturbed. The red flags were replaced by metal stakes with reflective tape. A makeshift barrier appeared overnight, thin plastic fencing strung along the edge of the gravel path, carrying a sign that read, "Construction Area, Authorized Personnel Only." He called the HOA office, demanding to know who had approved it. The receptionist claimed ignorance, insisting that site safety adjustments were handled by external contractors. When he asked for the contractor's name, she said, almost cheerfully, "Oh, that's managed through our infrastructure consultant. It's confidential." The way she said it, as if secrecy were a perfectly acceptable part of community management, made him realize how insulated they had become from accountability. The HOA didn't operate like a civic body. It behaved like a small corporation, complete with its own hierarchy, its own private language of power. Late one afternoon, Mark returned from work to find a vehicle parked beside the tower, a white SUV with no license plates and tinted windows. A man in a reflective vest was kneeling near the base, photographing the support beams. When Mark approached, the man stood quickly and flashed an ID badge too fast for him to read. "Routine assessment," he said. "Just documenting for insurance." His voice carried the confident neutrality of someone accustomed to not being questioned. When Mark asked which insurance company, the man smiled and said, "The one that covers you, if you're smart." Then he climbed back into the SUV and drove away, leaving tire marks in the dust. For a long moment, Mark just stood there, listening to the wind whistle through the open lattice of the tower. The encounter left a taste of metal in his mouth. That night, he called the only person in the county office he still trusted, a mid-level administrator named Rachel, someone he'd known from years of maintenance work. She listened without interrupting as he recounted the events, the documents, the SUV, the false inspections. When he finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Mark," she said finally, "I can't say much, but there's been talk about reassigning certain assets, reclassifying them under private infrastructure management. The HOA isn't acting alone. They've got approval from higher up, though not officially. Be careful. You're stirring something that people don't want stirred." Her voice cracked slightly, a mix of sympathy and fear. "And if I were you," she added quietly, "I'd make copies of everything, off-site." The next morning, he followed her advice. He scanned every page of the old maps, every letter, and uploaded them to a cloud account under an encrypted name. Then he drove to a print shop 2 towns away and had duplicates made, storing them in his glove compartment and in a weatherproof box buried beneath the toolshed. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was precaution. When he returned home, he found another envelope waiting on his doorstep. This one hand-delivered. The letter inside was brief, but carried a new tone. Less formal, more personal, as if someone had decided to drop the pretense. Mr. Hastings, your continued interference in community operations constitutes harassment. Failure to cease may result in civil and criminal action. Consider this your final notice. There was no signature, no letterhead, only a small embossed watermark, the stylized triangle of the HOA's emblem. That night, unable to sleep, Mark sat at his kitchen table, the lights dimmed, the sound of the refrigerator filling the silence. He thought about the tower, about how it had begun as a relic of his father's era, a symbol of continuity, and how it had become the center of an invisible war over control and narrative. He thought about the people who drank its water without knowing its origin, about the quiet arrogance of those who believed they could redraw lines on a map and change reality. The clock on the wall ticked methodically, and somewhere outside he heard the low hum of a generator, the same sound the tower's pumps made when they cycled pressure. Except this hum was farther away, mechanical but foreign. He stepped onto the porch and scanned the dark. Across the field, faint lights moved behind the trees. Flashlights, deliberate and slow, tracing the path toward the tower. He didn't call the police. He knew what they'd say. He simply watched until the lights vanished, leaving only the faint shimmer of the tower against the night sky. When he finally went back inside, he realized that the war had already entered its next stage, one that wouldn't be fought through letters or surveys, but through quiet, irreversible actions carried out in the dark. The midpoint of his struggle wasn't marked by discovery, but by the moment he understood that truth alone would no longer save him. He would have to decide how far he was willing to go to defend something everyone else had already decided no longer belonged to him. By the time October settled over the valley, the fight for the tower had shifted from the absurd to the unbearable. The HOA no longer bothered with polite letters or formal notices. Instead, they moved with quiet aggression, as if the matter had already been decided behind closed doors. One morning, Mark drove up the hill and found the tower fenced off with heavy wire panels and a sign that read, "Restricted Zone, Pending Demolition Approval." The padlocks were new, industrial grade, stamped with serial numbers. Someone had taken ownership of his life's landscape overnight, without warning, without consent. He stood for a long time before the barrier, his reflection trembling faintly in the steel mesh, and realized that he had become invisible in his own story. The official narrative now named the tower an abandoned structure, its caretaker unknown, its operation unauthorized. He, the man who had kept it breathing through decades of rust and neglect, had been erased by paperwork. He tried the county again, but each department sent him in circles. The zoning office claimed that demolition orders were not under county authority. The Public Utilities Board said the HOA was handling its own maintenance under a pilot privatization initiative. Even his supervisor, who once joked about bureaucratic nonsense, had grown cautious, ending every conversation with the same phrase, "Let it go, Mark. It's not worth it." That warning, repeated so often, began to sound like a threat disguised as concern. Yet letting go wasn't possible. He felt a moral tether to that tower, not because of ownership or nostalgia, but because it represented something pure, unaltered by convenience. Every new regulation and false claim felt like a blade cutting through that tether, severing the last honest connection he had to a world that still made sense. One night he returned home late from work and saw unfamiliar lights on the ridge. Bright white beams swinging in arcs, mechanical and deliberate. He parked his truck on the roadside and climbed the slope through the tall grass, moving quietly until he reached the fence. Two men in hard hats stood at the base of the tower, measuring the support columns and spraying orange markings on the concrete. A third man stood near a generator speaking into a radio. Their jackets bore no company logo, only reflective stripes. Mark called out, demanding to know who authorized their work. They froze for a moment, exchanging glances, before one of them stepped forward and said flatly, "We're conducting a safety survey, sir. You're not allowed in this zone." The phrase sounded memorized. He asked for identification, and the man replied, "You'll have to contact the association for documentation." When Mark refused to leave, they packed up silently and drove away, leaving the generator still humming and a half-finished circle of paint beneath the tower. The next morning he found the generator gone, but the paint expanded into a full outline, a perfect ring around the structure, as though marking the boundary of its future absence. Nearby, someone had planted a wooden post with a small laminated tag. Demolition per permit, 3444B. He knew that permit numbers in that sequence didn't exist. He'd handled similar paperwork for years. It was another fiction, another step in the process of making lies official. That day he filed a formal complaint with the county attorney's office, attaching photographs and his original survey copies. Weeks passed without response. When he finally received an answer, it was a single-page letter stating that the matter fell outside of active jurisdiction pending land reclassification. It was a perfect bureaucratic sentence, circular, meaningless, immune to interpretation. Gradually, the pressure expanded beyond the tower. His mailbox began filling with anonymous flyers describing him as a hazard to community safety. Neighbors avoided him, pretending not to see him when they crossed the road. Even the local grocery clerk, once friendly, began scanning his purchases in silence. The isolation settled over him like damp air, seeping into his bones. He tried to tell himself that it didn't matter what they believed. The truth wasn't dependent on popularity. But in quiet moments, when he sat on his porch at dusk, he felt the weight of being outnumbered not by force but by indifference. Lies didn't need to convince everyone. They just needed to be easier to believe than the truth. Then came the lawsuit. Delivered by courier in a crisp envelope, it accused him of interfering with authorized safety procedures and creating environmental risk through unlicensed maintenance. The irony was suffocating. The man who had maintained safety for years was now charged with endangering it. The case was filed in civil court under expedited review, a process designed to move faster than he could react. He couldn't afford an attorney specialized in property law, but he found one willing to consult on the side. A weary woman named Denise who spoke with measured calm. After reading through the documents, she exhaled slowly and said, "They've built a procedural maze. Even if you prove your facts, the case isn't about facts anymore. It's about perception. They're counting on you to lose momentum." She paused, tapping the edge of the file. "If you really want to win, you'll have to expose the intent behind this. Find the reason they want it gone." Her words reignited something stubborn inside him. He returned to the site with fresh eyes, studying not the tower itself, but the land around it. A week earlier, he'd noticed survey markings extending beyond the fence, into the adjacent lot. Now he followed them, orange lines that curved down toward the creek bed, crossing into a wooded area that had recently been cleared. There he found stakes labeled with a new development code, Phase 2 expansion. It wasn't about the tower at all. The HOA had approved plans for an upscale complex, complete with artificial ponds and new irrigation lines. The tower stood directly on the pipeline route. Removing it wasn't maintenance, it was groundwork for profit. Armed with photographs and coordinates, he confronted Creel, the HOA director, at the association office. The conversation was brief but electric. Creel didn't deny the development. He simply smiled and said, "Progress requires compromise, Mr. Hastings. Some structures outlive their purpose." Mark replied quietly, "Purpose isn't for you to define." Creel's expression hardened. "Then you'll learn the cost of defiance." He said it casually, almost kindly, but the words lingered like static in Mark's ears long after he left. That evening he drove home through the drizzle, headlights carving tunnels of pale light through the mist. The tower loomed above the trees, half shrouded in fog, its steel ribs glistening with rain. He parked and stepped out, letting the cold soak through his jacket, and for the first time he felt the weight of inevitability pressing on him. They would come again, not with warnings but with machines. The ground was already mapped for its own destruction, the permits already written into existence. Yet beneath the fear there was something else. A strange calm, the kind that comes when a man has been stripped of illusion. He couldn't win through argument or procedure, but he could refuse to disappear quietly. He looked up at the darkened silhouette, its ladder glinting faintly under the rain, and whispered, "They can't bury what still stands." The morning of the hearing broke grey and silent, a thin fog clinging to the low hills like smoke that refused to lift. Mark Hastings sat in his truck outside the courthouse, his binder of documents resting on the passenger seat, the corners worn from being handled too many times. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten much either. His stomach felt like a knot of wire. The county had scheduled the proceeding under the neutral title of Property Reassessment Review. But everyone knew it was the deciding act, the moment when the fate of the tower, and by extension everything he'd fought for, would be sealed under a few lines of legal prose. He could see members of the HOA board gathered near the entrance, their umbrellas forming a neat line, their expressions calm and distant, like people waiting for a train that had never been late in their lives. Robert Creel was among them, his posture confident, his briefcase polished to a dull shine. Mark sat for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, and told himself that fear was useless now. The machine had already been built around him. All he could do was walk through it and hope to leave a mark before it closed. Inside, the hearing room smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. A small audience had gathered, mostly HOA members and a few curious locals who whispered as he entered. The judge, a woman with silver hair tied neatly at her nape, called the session to order and asked both parties to present their statements. The HOA's attorney spoke first, gliding through her argument like a script she'd rehearsed for weeks. She described the tower as a deteriorating hazard, a structure of uncertain ownership and potential liability. Her voice carried the weight of confidence born from expectation, the assurance that bureaucracy was on her side. When she finished, Creel stood to add a few measured words about community welfare and modernization, invoking the language of progress as if it were morality itself. When it was his turn, Mark rose slowly, carrying his binder to the table. He didn't read from prepared notes. He had memorized the story too well. He spoke about the history of the tower, how it had been built under a public works project long before the HOA existed, how it had continued to serve not just his property, but the community itself. He presented the original surveys, the maintenance records, the letters from his father's era bearing the county seal. He explained how the new maps had been falsified, how permits were issued without signatures, how inspection teams had trespassed on land they had no right to enter. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of skepticism in the room, the quiet resistance of people who wanted to believe the simpler version of events. But when he unfolded the old vellum survey, the one with the hand-drawn coordinates and the faded note about county reserve land, something shifted. The judge leaned forward, squinting, tracing the lines with her finger. "This map predates the association by nearly 20 years, she said, "and there's no record of transfer." The HOA's attorney hesitated for the first time, flipping through her files with quick, anxious movements. "That document was never verified," she murmured. Mark handed over the second piece of evidence, a copy of the HOA's development blueprint he had found behind the creek bed, showing the planned expansion directly through the tower's base. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. The judge looked up at Creel. Were these plans submitted as part of your application for reclassification? Creel smiled faintly, but his voice betrayed a hint of unease. They were preliminary assessments, he said. No action has been taken. The judge turned back to Mark. Do you have proof that construction activity has already begun? He reached into his folder and produced the photographs, orange survey markings, tire tracks, the outline painted in demolition spray, the laminated tag reading permit under 344B. He placed them one by one on the desk until they formed a quiet, undeniable mosaic of intrusion. The judge leaned back, folded her hands, and exhaled slowly. For several moments, no one spoke. Then she said, "It appears the association has acted beyond its jurisdiction." Her voice carried no triumph, only weariness. Effective immediately, all demolition or construction activities near this structure are to be halted pending a full investigation into the authorization process. The HOA's lawyer began to protest, but the judge cut her off with a raised hand. And if these documents prove falsified, the matter will be referred to the district attorney's office. The words hung in the air like a verdict carved from stone. Mark didn't smile. He simply closed his binder and lowered his head. The sound of his heartbeat filled his ears, steady and disbelieving. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, and the courthouse steps gleamed wet under the dim light. Creel approached him briefly, his expression composed, but his voice brittle. "You've delayed the inevitable," he said quietly. "You think you've won something, but this place runs on momentum. You can't stop progress." Mark met his gaze and answered with calm finality, "Progress isn't the same as theft." Creel's jaw tightened before he turned away, his polished shoes tapping rhythmically against the concrete. That night, Mark drove back to the ridge. The tower stood as it always had, unmoved, unbothered, its steel ribs glowing faintly in the moonlight. The red flags had been trampled by rain and wind, the fence half collapsed, the earth scarred with tire ruts that already began to fade. He climbed the small hill, feeling the wet soil give under his boots, and placed his hand on the metal surface once more. The hum of the pipes was steady, rhythmic, a pulse that hadn't changed despite everything. For the first time in months, the air around him felt still, the silence not heavy but earned. He didn't know what the next week would bring, whether the county would pursue charges or bury the case in paperwork, but for now, the tower was safe. It had survived the machinery of deceit, at least for a while, and that survival felt like a kind of victory. When he finally walked back down the slope, the night was clear, the stars faint but visible, and for a fleeting moment he believed that endurance, quiet and uncelebrated, was the only real justice left in the world. Winter came early that year, softening the valley with mist and frost, muting the world into shades of pale gray. The hearings were over, the injunctions signed, and the HOA had retreated into its routine silence, though no one ever issued an apology or an admission. The tower remained, its silhouette stark against the cold sky, the pipes still carrying water through unseen veins beneath the ground. For the first time in months, Mark felt the rhythm of his day's return, the sound of the pump clicking in the distance, the low hum of machinery he trusted more than people. The county sent a letter acknowledging temporary custodianship of the structure, naming him as its designated caretaker until jurisdictional review was complete. It was not a victory in the heroic sense, but it was recognition, faint and practical, like light seeping through a closed curtain. Neighbors began to greet him again, cautiously at first, then as if nothing had ever happened. Some pretended not to remember their silence during the ordeal, while others spoke about misunderstandings and overreactions. Mark didn't hold grudges. He simply nodded and went back to his work. The HOA replaced Creel quietly, electing a new board that promised transparency and community healing, though he noticed that the same old phrases, order, safety, progress still lingered in their newsletters. Change, he had learned, was rarely as clean as paperwork suggested. On weekends, he climbed the hill and stood beside the tower, watching the way the metal caught the morning light. The structure no longer felt like a burden or a symbol to defend. It was simply a fact that existed beyond permission, a piece of history that had resisted revision. He sometimes imagined his father standing beside him, nodding in quiet approval, the way he used to when something was fixed with patience instead of force. In the distance, new houses were rising where the forest had been cleared, neat and pale against the horizon. Life, as always, moved on. But the tower remained a quiet defiance, a small imperfection in a world that craved uniform lines. One evening, as dusk fell and the air turned metallic with cold, Mark locked the gate and listened to the wind move through the frame, producing a low, resonant tone that sounded almost like breathing. He realized then that survival wasn't about winning or proving anyone wrong. It was about existing through erasure, about refusing to vanish even when the world had redrawn its borders. The tower had taught him that, and in its shadow he found something like peace. Not triumph, but endurance, quiet and steady, the kind that couldn't be legislated away.